Live from the Hilton Resort in Barbados, welcome to the 7th Annual Caribbean Sustainable Energy Forum. It's time for Session 1, entitled Enabling the Environment, Policy, Regulations and Investment. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and welcome to CARICOM Sustainable Energy Forum 2021, Day 2. It's my distinct pleasure to be the session chair of today's topic, enabling the environment, policy, regulations, and investments. The format today will be 2 hours. We'll begin with presentations from our distinguished panel, followed by a session where we get to interact with them and ask in-depth questions. It's my simple pleasure today to introduce this illustrious group of experts and facilitate the session. When I introduced the Cayman Islands National Energy Policy as a private member's motion in 2016, which was subsequently passed unanimously by the government, I felt that renewable energy was the way forward, even though it seemed like I was the lone wolf crying out in the wilderness at the time. I did have help, though. The help of CARICOM, in particular, Dr. Devin Gardner, to whom I owe a great debt. I also had help from Barbados, so it's interesting that I'm here all these years later, where I met the Williams Industries Group at a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association conference at this very hotel, and it was invited to tour some of their facilities. David Staples came and spoke at my energy summit that I established and hosted in the Cayman Islands. And that changed hearts and minds and furthered the cause. I just wish I had the powerhouse resources and in-depth knowledge assembled today, both on stage and virtually. I would like to publicly thank all those who graciously assisted in making the Cayman Islands National Energy Plan something real. And I look forward to hearing today's speakers. And without further ado, I will invite another fellow Winston, Professor Winston Moore, who's presently a professor of economics and deputy principal at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. Since joining the university, he's also been the head of the Department of Economics and the director of the School for Graduate Studies and Research. Professor Moore is a very active public commentator on issues related to the national development and is a former president of the Barbados Economic Society. His recent research has examined the issues surrounding the green economy, private sector development, as well as the economic impact of climate change on tourism. Professor Moore has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, books, and book chapters. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Surrey, Master of Science in Economics from the University of Warwick, and a BSc in Economics from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. Caribbean countries could address their economic vulnerabilities by pursuing a development strategy built around the green economy, which could also address their social and environmental challenges. This was a quote by Professor Winston Moore and his co-authors. I would invite Professor Moore to intervene now with delivering green and blue economics through sound policies and regulations. Professor Winston Moore.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm not going to get another opportunity to say this, so I'm going to say thank you very much, Winston. And I am very much happy to be here at this forum to discuss the issues surrounding supporting green economy through regulations and policies. If I may have permission to share my screen, I will first, I will start my presentation. All right, so until that is sorted, I will just get started. You know, one of the things that economists for a long time have always spoken about is this disconnect between the economy and the environment, in that there's really no way to grow the economy unless you damage the environment. And that seems to be the notion that we are working with throughout the entire world, that in order to generate greater growth, we need to damage the environment in some way. So if we're going to engage in more tourism, we need to you know, damage our marine and coastal zones, and that isn't necessarily the case. And that is why I've sort of spent most of my last couple of years working on the issue of the green economy. And there are three key reasons that persons normally associate economic growth with the environment. And the first one is people desire economic growth for a number of reasons. The first reason is that we all like to spend. We're coming up to the Christmas season now, and we are looking forward to spending and buying gifts for our family and friends. And I am looking forward to buying a gift for myself, which I normally do every Christmas. But we like to consume. One of the implications of consumption is that it has a negative impact on the environment. The second thing is that there's this really close link between the environment and social outcomes. So as we grow the economy, we can potentially address issues in relation to poverty alleviation. Growth generates jobs. It allows persons to move up the social ladder. And there's this really great link between growth and social outcomes. And hence, therefore, we want more growth. And then also the link between the growth and corporate profits. We all work for some type of enterprise. And growth is definitely linked in some way to the profits and the opportunities of that enterprise. I work at a university, and universities are not for profits, but we still look at the economic growth prospects, because as soon as we see a decline in economic growth, we know that our students are going to have a difficult time paying their fees. And we're also going to have a difficult time raising grants as well. So growth is a fundamental part of what we do. There's also lots of competition between countries as well. And as countries compete to offer goods and services to the rest of the world, it has an impact on natural resources. And then firms also compete as well. And as firms are competing, this has impacts on this also results in greater utilization of resources as well. And then finally, the impact of climate change. As firms tend to compete, and as we consume more goods and services, This has a negative impact on biodiversity. And as we know, the impact within the Caribbean on coral bleaching, ocean acidification, and other issues. Now, there's this really great environmental concept called the environmental Kuznets curve. And if the environmental Kuznets curve is true, then it therefore means that we really don't need any regulation, because what the environmental Kuznets curve suggests is that as countries grow through their initial growth period, they're obviously going to utilize more natural resources, and there's going to be this negative impact on the economy. But after a certain point, after that turning point, after economies get to a point where they can afford to invest in energy conservation, then you see this decline in environmental degradation. So if this model is correct, we therefore don't need any regulation, because firms are going to invest in environmental conservation. Countries are going to invest in environmental conservation. We just need to wait until countries and firms get rich enough. Now, you're going to tell me, Professor, of course, that is not the case, because we can see that based on what is happening across the globe. If the environmental Kuznets curve was true, we wouldn't have to be negotiating to stay alive as a region. We wouldn't have that slogan 2.5 to stay alive. And there are a number of reasons why the environmental Kuznets curve doesn't hold, but one of the fundamental reasons is that the environmental degradation that we're seeing to the planet does not offset the conservation that is taking place at the moment. So the scale is somewhat tipped on the side of against the environmental Kuznets curve, rather than the idea of for the environmental Kuznets curve. And therefore, we have this concept of the green economy. And what the green economy suggests is that through a series of targeted public spending, policy reforms, and regulatory changes, you can generate public and private investment in areas that will stimulate the green economy. And we have a number of really great illustrations throughout the Caribbean. In Jamaica, through their regulatory changes, they were able to stimulate the investment in wind energy. Barbados, we had James Husbands yesterday receiving the award. That industry was actually stimulated by a tax credit that was implemented in the 1980s. So without that tax intervention, we wouldn't have seen the growth of solar water heater industries within Barbados. So regulations and targeted regulations are a really important part of stimulating investment and really leading to the growth of the green economy. Now, when I use the term green economy, all I'm referring to is economies that would result in low emissions, as well as greater efficiency in the use of our resources. So it's all about efficiency in terms of how we produce our goods, but also efficiency in terms of how we utilize our resources. And there are these three key characteristics of well-designed green regulation. And what I'm hoping to do in my presentation is to set the broad framework, and then my colleagues are going to give you more specific details as well in relation to illustrations of how these concepts actually can work in practice. And one of the things that we have seen from most of the literature and also our experiences is that we need to determine the rights of investors. And those rights need to be transparent. Investors like to know that they can come into a country, or your investors in your country. So domestic investors like to know that these are the rules of the game. And once you know the rules of the game, then you are willing to put your money into that project and therefore stimulate economic activity in that area. You also need to look at what type of incentives you're creating with your regulation. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about incentives a little bit further on in my presentation as well. But incentives need to reduce. We need to look at the issue of regulatory changes, because one of the worst things that you can do as a regulator is have these changes in your regulation taking place every single year or taking place on a regular interval. You want to have some type of regulatory regime that the investors are confident that they're not going to lose their money due to a change in the regulatory regime. So we need the transparency, and we need also to reduce the risk of regulatory changes. Then I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at this issue of removing incentives on fossil fuels, because we talk a lot about giving incentives or providing incentives, but removing incentives on fossil fuels can actually be a way to stimulate and drive the green economy. And then also we need to have very clear standards for your particular, for stimulating growth in the green industry. One good example of this is maybe in relation to electric vehicles. If you're going to have charging points around the entire country, around the entire island, you need standards in relation to charging. And so standards become a very important part of investment within your industry if you're going to stimulate the electric vehicles in your country. And then finally, you need to remove barriers. One of the really great things about the whole idea of renewable energy is that you can democratize energy generation. So as James Husbands was speaking yesterday about your solar water heaters, no longer do you have to purchase electricity and then use that to heat your water. You can actually generate your own hot water at home using your solar water heater system. So in that way, you're removing barriers for individuals and removing barriers for households. So you're democratizing the ownership of resources in your country. And as a regulator, as a politician, this can only lead to greater benefits for individuals in the economy. There is one area that I do want to touch on before I look at the whole issue of regulation. And that is the idea that maybe we can have some type of self-regulation. And why is self-regulation useful? Whenever we use the term regulation, both as economists and as policymakers, people always think that you're restraining something, you're stopping persons from doing something. So regulation has this very bad connotation. So what you can maybe look at is the whole notion of corporate environmentalism. And this is the idea that the government actually doesn't need to get involved in a particular industry through the notion of resource dependency. Corporations and individuals themselves may actually be incentivized to invest in greener technologies. And the resource dependency theory suggests that companies are driven by their stakeholders. And through the leverage that these stakeholders have over the firms, they can drive firms to do particular or make investments in green areas. So one of the biggest stakeholders that companies have are consumers. And if your consumers withhold the key thing that they have, if consumers withhold their purchasing power if they withhold their money from you as a business, then this can lead you to make some really significant changes within the corporate environment. So there are really great examples of this in relation to Nike and also in relation to Shell. But also in relation to greening as well. This can be a really useful approach to encouraging greening within your particular country. And one of the biggest consumers that we have within any country is the government. The government's purse is responsible for around 20 to 30% of expenditure in most Caribbean countries. So if the government says, I'm only going to purchase green goods and services, that has a tremendous impact on firms within your country, because firms within your country are now going to start bringing in more green goods and services. So think about what would happen if Caribbean governments say that they're only going to purchase electric vehicles from now on. That therefore means that most of the car dealerships in the region will now start bringing in more electric vehicles. And by bringing in more electric vehicles, those electric vehicles then would filter down to the rest of the market. So you're then going to see more households purchasing electric vehicles as well. So the whole notion of of the consumer and the consumer driving environmentalism is actually a really important part of what we do and what we can do as policymakers. The next thing that we can do as policymakers is that we can provide subsidies. Now, as an economist in the Caribbean, I try not to push this particular area because most Caribbean countries have a lot of fiscal challenges. Caribbean countries have issues in relation to high levels of debt, and there's so many demands for tax revenue. So looking at this current environment, we have demands for tax revenue for healthcare, and then also to continue to stimulate our economies to pull us out of this recession. But I'm still going to spend maybe like a few seconds on this. And what subsidies can do is that subsidies can provide you a really important way of catalyzing and really stimulating the growth of your industry. And I'm really going to go back to James Husbands, and because he was the awardee this year, that industry, that solar water heater industry, was really incentivized and really got going because of the incentives that was provided to households. So householders were able to write off around $6,000 for tax purposes in Barbados. If you think, if you put that in context, the typical Barbadian earns around $24,000 per year in terms of their income. So if you can write off $6,000 per year for your solar water heater system, that is a significant proportion of your income that you can get back simply by investing in a renewable energy technology. So these types of subsidies can also be very important. But as I said, what I want to do more as a Caribbean economist, I want to focus on how we can remove incentives or remove subsidies to finance greening, because there are lots of subsidies that are in place in most Caribbean countries that we're not aware that they're there, but because they're there, they actually are leading to things that we don't actually want. And by removing those subsidies, we can use the revenue that we save to finance greening our industries or finance incentives to green the economy. And there are subsidies in relation to fishing. And one of the things that subsidies in fishing does is that it leads to overfishing. And the cost approximately of this overfishing is tremendous. Throughout the Caribbean, there are subsidies on fossil fuels. The estimate worldwide is that we have subsidies of around $423 billion in relation to subsidies. And simply by removing those subsidies, we can provide incentives for greening the economy. One of the reasons why persons say that we can't remove these subsidies is because of the negative impact on poverty. But that negative impact on poverty comes through this traditional view that greening is going to lead to job losses. But that is sort of like an old view of things. And if you look at how innovation takes place, innovation is never that linear. Whenever you have innovation, you usually have a little bit more dynamic and complex process. So you have if you green your industries, what is going to happen? Your traditional industries are actually going to start investing in those green technologies. So remember I told you about those car companies bringing in electric vehicles. They're going to start training mechanics to repair those electric vehicles. And you're going to see new industries popping up as well. So what might happen is through the regulations that you put in place to support greening, it might actually lead to greater jobs and may lead to greater economic activity in your country. There is just one issue that I want to mention before I end, and that is this potential problem that Minister Simmons mentioned yesterday. One of the things that happens when you put green taxes in place is that they do a really good job of changing behavior, but by changing behavior, it also puts a challenge or impacts on the public purse, and it can lead to reduced tax revenue. So therefore, when you are putting these policies in place, you also have to look at it from a medium to long-term perspective, because in the short term, you're going to change behavior, but in the medium term, you're going to have to make up for your lost tax revenue as a result of the changed behavior. So So generally, hopefully I've stuck close to my time of 15 minutes. The characteristics of green regulations. Green regulations can be a really great way of incentivizing investment in small open economies. I haven't focused too much on the notion of subsidies. What I have encouraged though is that by removing subsidies, you can actually use that to provide incentives for greening your economy. So what I would encourage Caribbean governments to do and policymakers is to look at what types of subsidies they're providing. And maybe by removing those subsidies, you can actually incentivize your green industries. And then the policy measures that you're aiming, looking at the issue of poverty, try not to provide broad-based policy measures. So for example, maybe if you're trying to reduce the impact of a spike in oil prices on the poor, you don't want to reduce the electricity bills of everyone. You want to reduce the electricity bills of individuals that are poor. And so therefore you need more targeted subsidies aimed at poor individuals. And then training is very important as we transition to the green economy. So Chair, it was my pleasure to be here this morning, and I just sort of set the broad context in relation to regulating green industries, and hopefully you found it useful.
Thank you, Professor Moore, for that intervention. And I just want to stress that at the end of this session, what we want to achieve is clear, hard recommendations for all those listening audience, and especially the energy ministers around the Caribbean. So I task my panel with that. And I also like to remind the virtual audience that there will be a poll available on our virtual platform. You can share your view on issues on policy, legislation, and more. And before we start the next session and I introduce the next speaker, one of the polling questions I've been asked to ask the audience is, do you think that CARICOM countries have adequate policy and regulatory frameworks that can attract the multi-million-dollar investments that are necessary in their energy transitions? A, all countries have policy and regulatory frameworks that are adequate. B, many countries have policy and regulatory frameworks that are adequate. C, only a few countries have policy and regulatory frameworks that are adequate. D, no country has the policy and regulatory framework that is adequate. Or E, I'm not sure. So while I introduce the next speaker, please think about that and answer on the platform. My next speaker is a fellow lawyer, and I won't hold that against him. He's the Honorable Kerry Simmons, MP. He's the Minister of Energy, Small Business, and Entrepreneurship for Barbados. He will speak about a policy-centric approach to the acceleration of sustainable energy deployment in small markets. Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Master of Ceremonies. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow colleague ministers in CARICOM, I am delighted to be able to do this presentation with you today. I want to begin by, first of all, directing your attention to the fact that our ambition in Barbados was to be the first 100% renewable energy and carbon neutral island state by the year 2030. Some say it was a heroic ambition, but that is what it is. And it really constitutes or is based on a vision which is for energy security and energy affordability through diversity and collaboration. Let me speak a little bit to the energy security and affordability. It is easy to understand because, quite frankly, now we are living that reality. If we look at natural gas demand globally, we would recognize that Asia's demand for natural gas, Europe's demand for natural gas have absolutely skyrocketed beyond what they were pre-COVID levels. And quite frankly, the supply has been very constrained globally. So that obviously we're in a situation where demand has outstripped supply, and the basic law of economics therefore is that the prices will rise. And that is what we are being forced to contend with. The difficulty is that we obviously have to maintain our effort at energy security and affordability as part of the core structure of our energy policy, because this energy policy really is intended to bring into Barbados about $4 billion, or $2 billion if I use US currency, $2 billion US dollars, $4 billion Barbados dollars in investment. So it is something that we have to keep our eye on and maintain a very strong commitment to. The challenge I'm having here is that I'm not seeing the slide. The need to, the considerations of the national energy policy, and if you can assist me by making the slide a little bit clearer or sharper. It is necessary for us to have a bottom-up collaborative approach which will be heavily reliant on cross-sectoral consultations. Now, basically, we want in Barbados to have an energy policy structure and an implementation process that is based on consensus. And we've done a lot of work on not avoiding superimposing a policy on the sector, but rather having the sector benefit from a wide cross-section of inputs and discussions. That has been a multi-criteria approach, and it has featured a combination of our focus, which has seen a combination of finance, considerations on the economic impacts on the sector, the impact we would have on our environment, questions of technology that would have to be adopted, and obviously the social impact of the policy. This has been done across the whole base of the energy sector, so that we've done this in the context of looking at our impact in all of these ways on renewable energy and also on the fossil fuel side of the energy mix. There are 6 tenets to the Barbados National Energy Policy. First of all, and I suppose the most easy to follow, is the fact that we want it to be a very reliable and safe and affordable and sustainable, modern and climate-friendly policy and a strategy that can be easily implemented. Second is that there will be zero domestic consumption of fossil fuel. And that goes in tandem with the third consideration or third tenet, which is that there will be an export of all hydrocarbons on land and offshore. Now, for those of you across CARICOM who are familiar with Barbados, you know very well that we are not a major energy producing company. We are not in the oil and gas way as, for example, our neighbor to the south. But the fact, or neighbors, I should say now, to the south. But the fact of the matter is that we do have some onshore production, and we do have very good reason to believe that we will be able to source offshore Barbados some fossil fuel. Now, the reality is that we have set ourselves an ambitious goal, which is taking us to being fossil fuel-free, domestic consumption, zero carbon footprint by 2030. The rest of the world, however, has been a little bit more slow in their ambitions, or limited in their ambitions. Their pace and scope sees many of them going to 2050 and beyond. So if we were fortunate enough to find oil offshore Barbados, what then do we do with it? We are still a small island developing state. We still have some substantial debt repayments to deal with. You just heard Professor Moore. And it is that sweet spot that now must be found at a policy level between avoiding your damage to the environment and also at the same time maintaining your commitments to economic growth and development. And the thinking, therefore, is that if we were to find the hydrocarbons on land and offshore, what we would be doing is to export those hydrocarbons. Equally as part of the tenet, or equally important as part of the tenets of the energy policy, is the need to maximize local production, local participation in the process. And local participation goes straight to the root of what Professor Moore just talked about when he spoke about democratization. And frankly speaking, we see this as a major policy or major part of the policy architecture, because we want to make sure that individuals and corporations in Barbados are able to participate. And even when there are very large investments, for example, in excess of 10 megawatts, we would be thinking that the approach would be for there to be at least a 30% Barbadian participation in the structure of the investment. Again, very easy to understand is the fifth tenet of minimizing the outflow of foreign exchange, because the country obviously wants to be able to benefit by not spending any more foreign exchange on fossil fuels. Right now, quite frankly, we on an average pay about 550 million United States dollars every year with respect to the importation of fossil fuels in the Barbados economy. And last but not least is the very important issue of the regional center of excellence in research and development in this particular sphere being created. And we feel very strongly about this at a policy level, and the James Husband story will tell you why. Solar thermal was allowed to get to where it now is because of a very conscious effort to develop solar thermal in Barbados. And we believe that in this region, we can be leaders in renewable energy sector across all the spheres and theaters of the energy mix. And what we want to do, therefore, is to be able not just to save money, contribute to the environmental cleanup, but equally, what we want to do is to make sure that successive generations are able to build out better and have a better appreciation and understanding and really start to lead in global technology, and therefore contributing to this via research and development, in our judgment, is vitally important. The visionary goals are 10 in nature. And the visionary goals behind our energy policy would see a concentration on diversity of the energy mix, and that will see us looking at wind. We will look at, obviously, solar photovoltaics. We would look at biogas and ocean energy. We are very keen on the efficiency of the system, the renewable energy system. And I think if we are going to speak seriously to the policy-centered emphasis that we are bringing to this, you'll find it really in, as I said, the economic enfranchisement or economic democratization aspect of what we are aiming to do, and equally in the area of regulation. We have a Fair Trading Commission, which is the regulatory body. And again, everything that we do in Barbados in this regard is going to be subjected to the maximization of making sure that the opportunities for best practices in the regulatory environment are maintained. There are some key actions that have resulted in 54 megawatts of energy in Barbados being already installed on our grid and supplying 8% of renewable energy to the grid. Quite frankly, that information that I just gave you is a little bit dated, because over the course of the last few weeks, I think we have gotten a lot closer to 10%. The key actions can be itemized in the context of policy developments, in the context of economic incentives, and also via the technical studies which have been done. And I want to spend a little bit of time on each of those things. With regard to policy development, one of the first things that I would have done on becoming a Minister of Energy 15 months or so ago was to participate in the utility license negotiations and try to bring them to completion. The reality is that we had have a utility in Barbados which had enjoyed a monopoly for over 100 years. And part of the licensing challenges was to get the monopoly to start to think along the lines of being a partner in our development as opposed to functioning simply as monopolies tend to function. We've come away with a generation license, which is non-exclusive, and that will run for 25 years. A storage license, again, non-exclusive, another 25 years. A transmission and distribution license, which will run for 30 years. And you may ask the reason why that is a little bit longer. the truth of the matter is there are not a lot of people out there who are looking to make an investment in the network of the poles and wires, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I think the most important part for us in the region when we think about how we can manage the utility is the systems operation license, which is only 5 years. And that limited license, colleagues, allows for us to have the reins of the horse in our hands so that we can hold or better hold to account the performance level of the utility in the process of allowing this new market structure to unfold. Above and beyond that, we have paid some careful attention to draft wind energy policy guidelines for onshore wind. And we had to do this because, I need not tell you all, we are among the smallest of the islands. And the fact of the matter is that the technology has not yet come to the point where you can simply create a massive corridor for wind investment in Barbados without it having serious consequential and deleterious effects on other sectors, and quite frankly, on communities, noise, etc. And so therefore, we've defined some wind zones in order for us to be able to better facilitate investment. And that speaks to some of the policy issues that we've looked at. I wanted to spend a little time on the economic incentives. I went to Parliament a little while ago, and as an effort to spur investment in this renewable energy sector, taking us out of COVID, we have created a premium, an accelerated premium investment, which allows, or an accelerated premium investment tariff rather, which allows for the current tariff to have superimposed on it this accelerated premium tariff. And this is for those investments which are between 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts. We are trying to spur activity in the Barbados economy. There's a lot of capital which would otherwise have been put into more traditional areas of investment, perhaps tourism being one of them. And because of the uncertainty about the tourism sector right now, that capital has just simply sat there. We're saying it makes no sense for it to be sitting there. Let's put it to good use. One such area of investment opportunity, obviously, is in the renewable energy sector. And so, therefore, it is a way of inducing, if you will, those people who are sitting on sums of capital to come in and make investment between 1 and 5 megawatts in Barbados. It is targeted at the Barbadian community, and we are expecting that we should see at least 75 megawatts being able to be brought on stream within the coming 6 months. Installation must be completed within the next 2 years for this premium tariff to be relevant. And of course, we have done that which we have traditionally done, and Professor Moore would have pointed you to it with regard to the water heaters. We have created the duty-free concessions for renewable energy equipment being brought into Barbados. Technical studies which have been done to undergird and to support the new market structure. We have done an integrated resource and resilience plan. We are conducting ocean energy studies and investigating the impact and the possibility and feasibility for offshore wind, and that would be both the fixed and floating platforms and ocean technology. And of course, we've done an e-mobility strategy for Barbados, which looks into the integration of electronic vehicles into the Barbadian energy sector. And I should say, colleagues, I am deeply indebted to Professor Moore for his work. It has pointed us to a fact that we, quite frankly, right now, get around 300 million Barbados dollars in revenue every year as a result of the fossil fuel-based taxes that we have in this economy, in the transportation sector. If we pull all of that out, we therefore have a hole in the Barbados economy of $300 million local currency. Obviously, in our circumstances, that cannot happen. And so therefore, one of the things that that study was able to allow us to do, and we've already taken it to Cabinet and started the deliberation, is we've had the benefit from the study of looking at some options which can feasibly be put in place so that we can compensate for the possible losses in revenue. And Professor Moore just spoke extensively on that. In addition to that, there have been some other key actions to support the energy sector. We've had our feed-in tariffs in place for a while, which exist for renewable energy systems for up to 10 megawatts, and they're guaranteed for the next 20 years. Government is also looking, as Professor Moore again quite rightly pointed you to, government has already committed to the purchase of electric or hybrid vehicles where possible, only as we go forward, so that we are trying to shape that climate of future consumer behavior in precisely the same way that was just suggested. I took to Parliament this year as well, a piece of legislation which was designed to phase out the importation into the country and sale of inefficient lighting. So all of the incandescent bulbs and so on now become illegal. We've given a period of time so that we do not gratuitously act in an offensive way to the merchant community, but by the start of January 2022, there will be no more importation and sale of those bulbs, and the phase-out process, depending on the wattage of the bulb, it changes every 6 months. So we start, let's say, with a 15 watt and then the 20 watt and so on and so forth as you go forward. As I indicated before, another initiative is the 30% local ownership and participation required for renewable energy investment. I think key, colleagues, to what we are doing in a small island has to be the way in which we have an adequate land use mix as part of the policy structure. And in Barbados, we are keenly interested in making sure that we have co-investment because there is land scarcity. And therefore, where there's agricultural land, we are trying to have the RE on non-arable or on the less arable parts of the island. But where it is possible to have it in key agricultural areas, equally, we are also looking to have a co-investment there that allows for the farming to take place, even as we are doing, say, solar photovoltaics, which are ground-mounted. So the dual land use is encouraged. All of this, of course, is achieved via the use of some traditional sources of financing for the financing of projects and programs. And this has been happening for a little while now in Barbados. And we have been fortunate to benefit from some partnerships with international development partners like the Inter-American Development Bank, the budget support from the European Development Fund, and of course grants from the Global Environmental Facility, the GEF. Among the projects and programs which have been financed by loans have been, I think perhaps the most outstanding one in terms of its impact has been a $10 million loan from the Inter-American Development Bank, which established an Energy Smart Fund to provide financial and technical support to the EE and RE projects across Barbados. In addition to that, we have had some funding assistance through the European Development Fund, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Program, and that has been a 6.5 million loan or support, rather, which has been aimed at project evaluation, communication, and visibility of the whole RE endeavor, and to support businesses moving towards energy sufficiency. The projects financed from grants would include the Disaster Risk and Energy Access Management, so-called DREAM project. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this particular project because of the fact that it really is about helping us plug some of the developmental loopholes. You just asked a very important question, Mr. Moderator. Are we in a position where we have all the regulations in place? Quite frankly, I think that if I were to speak for Barbados, the answer would be, this is a work in progress. And we set ourselves, as I said at the beginning, heroic undertakings of going where we want to get very quickly. And as I had to say only yesterday to the National Energy Forum Conference, we have gone at a pace which has invited tremendous interest, but at the same time, we've had to do work that other countries have had the benefit of deferring for a period of time. Now, involved in a lot of that work has to come, first of all, the training of the staff that have to do the work. And this is completely unprecedented stuff in the island, and I suspect that is true across the region. So that, for example, sitting down across the table with a utility that has its ownership in Canada and can, at the drop of a coin, have some highly paid professional and widely experienced professional advice and consultants and so on as their support structure is a very daunting task, because a lot of our people are learning this as they go along. And so therefore, we have to take some time to make sure you can finance the training that allows for the capacity to be there to deal with these negotiations. Equally, it is very important to recognize that we've got to train people on island to do the installations, and that means building out that cadre of persons who are now at National Vocational Qualificational level and CARICOM Vocational Qualificational level to be able to do the installation, to be able to do the maintenance. And that also helps us with the democratization of this sector, because it then allows for those groups of people to form their own installation companies, etc. And it takes me back to Professor Moore's very important point that it is not just a linear economy. When once you may have seen a closure of something because of the effort to go green, it creates consequential opportunities elsewhere. And so therefore, we are in the process of retooling and retraining people in this regard. Projects and programs are not just loan and grant, but they also are some with blended finance. And it is really important to tell you that we have benefited from partnership with the European Union and with the Inter-American Development Bank in this regard. There's a public sector Energy Smart program in Barbados. It was designed to promote and to implement viable RE and energy efficiency in the public sector. It is a $17 million loan from the IADB on one hand, and a 5.28 or 5.81 million euro loan from the from the European Union on the other. Now, what has it been able to help us do? It has been able to help us go to 20 government installations across the island, including Grantley Adams International Airport, including the cruise terminal at the Bridgetown Harbor. We've been able to put solar photovoltaics into those areas. Then at the Arch Hall Fire Station, there's also been the installation of solar PV. Key educational institutions, Mr. Moderator, for example, the Barbados Community College, now solar PV, and Samuel Jackman Prescott Institute of Technology, completely retrofitted, so that it has been able to help us go down a developmental path in terms of getting the public sector buildings to be now driven by clean energy. A vital development in this economy. There's also been non-traditional financing, and there is I am happy to say, an opportunity that was created in the early stages of this effort was the building out of a sustainable energy cooperative society in Barbados. And that has allowed us to mobilize the non-bank financial capital and to allow it to coalesce around assistance to the renewable energy effort in this country. And this is a mechanism for all Barbadians, therefore, to be able to invest in the energy sector so that you're not just talking the talk, but you're actually walking the walk when it comes to democratization of this sector. It was formed in 2019, and it obviously, therefore, helps to facilitate local ownership and participation. Williams Caribbean Capital has come into the scene through the private sector with issuing green energy bonds, and Climate Bonds Standard Board has approved the certificate of the Williams Renewable Energy Limited for fixed rate notes. So that is a local development and a local finance intervention about which we feel very proud on the island. I want to say in conclusion that the transition, as I said to you, is estimated to cost us or bring to us $2 billion United States dollars in investment. At a time like this, when the major traditional player, tourism, is on bended knee, that is a wonderful road for us to be able to walk on. Barbados has been investing in renewable energy in a limited way for a number of years now, but this is a period of time which is seeing us now have in place the infrastructure, if you will, to allow for the process to intensify and pick up speed. Our policies and regulations are being completed. That work is ongoing, and I am satisfied that up to this stage, it looks to me as though all that we are doing is helping us to come to a point where we are extremely attractive for financing purposes. The expressions of interest, both domestically and from overseas, are very impressive, and I can only say to you that, colleagues, if we can lend any assistance in terms of experiences that we have had, helping you to avoid missteps as you go through your own journey, then Barbados stands willing, ready, and able, and happy to do so. I am obliged to you.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. I applaud Barbados in what it's doing. I think it's setting a shining example for the rest of the region and CARICOM. I'm a little jealous because I too wanted 100% renewable energy by 2037, but as politics goes, sometimes you end up with a negotiated position, and where ours is 70% by 2037. Noting the time and noting that we have 10 minutes per speaker, I also want to encourage those in the virtual landscape to submit your questions on the platform, because that will help the panel discussion, and so we invite you to do so. And also, just in the interest of time, as you can see, I'm not giving too much focus on the CVs of our speakers, but that's because just by them being here, you know that they are at the top of their game, you know that they know what they're talking about, and you know that they have the relevant experience to really dwell into this process and these topics. I'd like to ask Mr. Ernesto Gomez to bring his intervention on right-sizing regulations for small island electricity systems. Mr. Ernesto Gomez is the Director of Tariff Compliance and Standards at the Public Utilities Commission in Belize. He has a number of years of experience in this area, and he will join us from Belize today in virtual world. Thank you, and welcome, Ernesto.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, or good afternoon. In Belize, it's still 9:30. I'm not sure how late it is there, but thanks for having me in this forum. Let me share my screen. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Okay. So I have divided my presentation in 3 areas. One, I want to express the regulatory environment that we have set up here in Belize. Then I want to explain to the audience the characteristics of the Belize market and how it have evolved. And of course, the last topic, which is what we are doing right now to right-size the regulation for a better impact in taking in all these renewable energies into our energy mix. In 1992, the Electricity Act was passed in Belize, and it's still in effect. The important thing about this act is that it requires that all generation be selected through a competitive process, and that the rates that are allowed to be recovered should recover all reasonable costs, including capital expenditure and operation expenditure. In 1999, the Public Utilities Commission Act was set up, giving it powers to regulate the electricity industry, the water industry, and the telecommunication industry. In 2011, there was a renationalization of the utility because it had almost 75% shares of foreign investment. The Electricity Act and the PUC Act really have four major areas to consider. One is the planning, the procurement, the dispatching of the energy, and the delivery to the end user. Now, when we look at the country, we are very fortunate to be neighbors of Mexico, and we have an interconnection link with Mexico. If you're able to see the map, all the lines that are in red are transmission lines of 115 kilovolts. The lines that are in blue are 69 kilovolts. And the green ones are 34.5 kilovolts. But the connection with Mexico gives us a capacity of 50 megawatts. When you come down north from the country, we have a biomass plant called Belcogen of 14 megawatts. That's the excess that they have of power that they can push into the grid. Actually, the plant that they have installed is about 30 megawatts. Off the shore, we have an island of Kikakar that is in the process of being connected via submarine cable. In that island, we have 4 megawatts of diesel generation. Coming down to Belize City, there is a gas turbine that is fired with diesel at this time, and it's for emergency and block starting use only. That's a 22.5 megawatt plant. Then going down to the center of the country, there's also another biomass plant, Santander Energy Limited. Their excess energy that they feed into the grid is 8 megawatts. They actually have installed a 16 megawatt plant. They use half of the plant energy and the other half is exported into the grid. We also at the University of Belize has a 480 kilowatts solar energy that is used basically for as a prototype. The most important energy source though is the Macal River. The Macal River has in Cascade 3 hydroelectric plants. The reservoir, which is at the beginning of the or at the top of the river, is called Chalillo with a capacity of 7 megawatts. followed by the second plant called Moihon with 25 megawatts. And the final plant on the same river is Vaca with 19 megawatts. Going down south of the country, there is this heavy fuel oil plant called Bapcol. It uses a bunker C type or heavy fuel oil number 6. And that plant is used for recovery of the system, for any emergencies, any instability on the system. It is not of continuous use, and its use is minimal. At the end of the grid down south, there is a small run-of-the-river hydro plant of 3.6 megawatts. Throughout the years, Belize have been able to install many independent power producers into the grid. And in a chronological basis, in the 90s, they were able to build the transmission line and made the independent power producer from Bicol come into place, do the interconnection with Mexico. In the 20s, they constructed the 69 kV line. And of course, the Macal River installation of Chalillo and the Vaca plants. We also installed that diesel-fired gas turbine of 20 megawatts, and the Hydro Maya, which is the small hydro run-of-the-river plant in the south. Also, we had the biomass from Belcogen, the sugar industry, together with the fossil fuel from Bapcol down south. After 2010, we have had the solar plant that was donated by JICA, that's Japan International Cooperation Agency. And we've also had the second biomass plant of Santander on the middle 2010s. This is just a little panoramic view that I wanted to show the audience. You know, the hydros, I clearly colored it to have it all together. Then I have all the biomass together, and the solar, also the fossil fuel sections. So this is all the installations that are available in Belize. To give you an idea, most of the power that is consumed in Belize is renewable energy. I have on the screen what is projected for the next 5 years. Of course, the 2020 figures in there are actuals. But if you can see that renewable energy in country generation is over 90%. Overall, when we put in Mexico, then of course the percentage drop. But we are expecting to be by 2030 overall consumption of electricity in the vicinity of 70% or better. In this plan, we are going to achieve this by 2025. And the government policy is that any additional source of energy must be renewable. Now, I want to more or less explain the challenges that we're having. First of all, our legal framework permits that the single buyer to use their power as a dominant to take over the market, and sometimes not giving enough facilities for other developers to get into the market. No, we do not have a proper regulation that establishes that the utility must submit a least cost energy plan for review and approval. It was always understood that that's the case, and we're finding out that it's not always complied on. So there is a real need in the regulation for some details so that the participants in the market all work towards one common least cost energy plan. The utility sometimes misallocates the resources given for the supply of electricity, especially on an hour-by-hour basis. And as a result, without a proper regulatory framework, there are no limits to what they're actually doing or programming the resources on the day. So we find out that there's a problem, and better definition on the regulation is required. Actually, there is no regulation. We are at the moment we are presently developing one. We also find out that whenever we have a problem and there is a litigation in the courts of Belize, that the arbitrators or the court system doesn't really falls in line with the regulatory law, and sometimes I think they do not understand their authority and are tempted to make decisions on rates. We believe that is also a problem because the rates are set only by the regulator, not the courts. It is clear for us that the government has a strong stand on the distributed energy resources and captive power plants. So the lack of regulation there is a challenge for the system in Belize. Now, let me go to the rulemaking. At the moment, we have found out that for us to manage properly the power purchase agreements and everything that is out there, we need to get annual financial reports from the independent power producers. There was no regulation for it. So about 3 weeks ago, we signed into order a regulation that as of next year, 2022, all the independent power producers will be required by law to submit their financials to the regulator, to the PUC. Request for proposal regulations. We developed a regulation that tries to cover all the elements that are missing for us to have a proper execution of regulations, especially in the addition of renewable energy. We find out that it got too complex. And when we went for public consultation, the public was a bit confused with such a big document. So after the first round of consultation, we decided to break it up, right-size it, and put the attention to the specific regulation in order to get better results. In doing so, we find out that we're able to go into better details when developing these regulations as individual portions of what was originally the big one. So the request for proposal was very critical because it sets the rules of the game whenever a contest has to be carried out to select the new source of energy. Before, there was no regulations to guide anyone. And as a result, the developers would do their own lobbying to try to get their projects approved. It doesn't matter what it takes, either going through the utility, through the regulator, or through the government. All they want is do their investment. The customer complaint regulation, we also need to strengthen that. We find out that the court tends to override the complaint procedures that are in place at the utility level and at the regulator level in the name of natural law. And as a result of having encounters with the court, we decided to make some customer complaint regulation in order to address this problem. Now, utility purchasing agreements regulation. In Belize, the regulation for setting rate is based on the assets, a return on the assets. So we're finding out that we have no control on how the utility adds assets to their capital. And we want to make sure that the methods that they use to add capital, that they do it the least cost possible, because the ratepayers end up paying for all their assets that they purchase. So we have to build a regulation that is going to take care and make sure that their investments are the most prudent investments they can make. We have already prepared the draft of this, and it's ready for going to consultation. Now, on the utility planning and operation regulations, we find out that the big problem is that there's not an organized process to approve the future plan of the country. The utility, the dominant utility, normally does it on a 5-year plan, but that is their plan. We want to make a regulation that includes all the stakeholders, the policymakers, the government, the regulator, and the utility, and of course other general stakeholders, so that that plan can become a national plan rather than just being the utility, the licensee plan. And as a result, we find out that it was proper for us to set the rules that will give the customers assurance that this plan is to satisfy their demand at the cheapest possible way. And finally, the power purchase regulation, PPA, is really for any purchase of power to be done. After the request for proposal has been concluded and the developers have been selected, then it goes on to negotiation for a contract. We want to make sure that this is done at the best interest of the ratepayers. Because we're including all types of purchases, it also includes the distributed energy resources, which are the solar, the rooftop solars, and of course it includes the feed-in tariff and backup fees and all the licenses that need to go with it. So at this moment, we have already sent a draft to the stakeholders. We have gotten feedback from an initial consultation, and we're in the process of doing the markups to go on a second round of consultations. So I would say we're quite advanced on that one. Now, lessons learned. Over all these years, we have had some problems. And these regulations that we are detailing out, as I just explained, are expected to address all these problems. One is the conflict of interest by the dominant utility. The dominant utility, because of its size and because of its resources, is able to address most or anything that the market needs. Now that may create a conflict in somebody else trying to get into the market and compete. So that dominant and that conflict of interest needs to be addressed. Now, as I mentioned before, we need to have an approved national plan. The government, the Ministry of Public Utilities have their policies, continuously updating their policies, and the utility has their plan, the licensee. Somewhere between that, we need to marriage them together so that we can have a nationally approved plan that anybody can follow. Otherwise, developers will have their plan and will come with you, showing you their plan, and really not having a plan, you tend to give in to the developers' request and attending to plans that are not coherent with the overall growth of the system.
I think we're rounding up now for the last speaker, Ms. Angela Rainford, who is the founder of Seleco and Recomnear Frontier Ventures. Her latest accomplishment is just co-developing the largest solar plant in the Caribbean and the largest in Jamaica. And Angela brings a wealth of experience to this panel. She was formerly at Goldman Sachs and is very knowledgeable in the financing and the developing of these projects. So we're looking forward to hearing from her, her experiences and her advice to those listening on the virtual landfill so that they can learn, they can advance what she's done, and they can interact with her in the next panel. Thank you, Angela.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much for having me, Caribbean Sustainable Energy Forum. Pleasure to be here. Honorable Minister Carrie Symonds, pleasure to be on your lovely island. And of course, Mr. Connolly, thanks for the very precise introduction. So hopefully my presentation loads. Otherwise, I'll have to do it by freelancing. So the topic I've been asked to present on today is basically innovative project financing, finding scale in small energy markets. And that is definitely something that across the CARICOM is a challenge that we face. Whilst in Jamaica we like to say we're small but Talawa, means that you're small but you have a lot of might. Being small is sometimes a challenge, and I'm going to try to address that a little bit in this presentation. Let's make sure the clicker is working. Okay, so yes, I'm going to start with a cartoon to kind of wake everyone up. So in this cartoon, size matters. You can see kind of the gentleman on the other side who's a little bit small for his chair, and he's speaking with someone, and he basically says, yes, I can see there's definitely potential for growth. So size when it comes to financing is definitely something that one needs to address because a lot of the market looks for larger transactions, larger projects, and also not just looking for those larger transactions, but also the way in which we traditionally finance. It's been geared in such a way that for small transactions, whether it's commercial, residential, or smaller areas of the markets, it's a lot more challenging to get, basically to attract financing. So what I wanted to start off is by giving a quick overview in terms of the renewable energy financing landscape. What this slide, most of this information is coming from IRENA, which is a very, very good source for information. It shows where is the money coming from, right? I mean, you kind of need to know where it's coming from to be able to attract it and to understand the underlying interests of those various groups. So what I found very interesting is over the 5-year period between 2013 to 2018, 86% of total investment is from private capital, which I was very surprised by, because especially in the Caribbean, there's a lot of multilateral institutions, there's a lot of other forms of capital, public finance as well in terms of government financing, but the vast majority of financing actually comes from private capital, which means that we need to take into consideration private capital considerations. In terms of renewable energy projects, they're financed mainly by project-level conventional debt. And later in the presentation, I'll kind of show you what that structure tends to look like. We also do have commercial banks and investment banks playing a part, but again, they are not the vast majority of this market. So regions dominated. The other thing that I found fascinating, that basically developing and emerging economies, we are still underrepresented, not just in terms of scale, because there are a lot of large countries which would be classified as developing and emerging, but they only attract around 15% of global investment. So as a Caribbean operating in a market where it's dominated by private capital, it's traditionally financed by conventional debt, project financing debt, what does that mean for us? And this is, obviously I'm not expecting you to be able to see this because it's really tiny and there's too many colors on the screen. But if you do get a presentation, a copy of the presentation, show me the money, what you're starting to see is the flows. And a lot of the flow of capital is coming from project developers, it's project financing base, it's going mainly to Europe, so we're getting only a small portion of the financing. And the interesting thing as well is in terms of the technologies which are being attracted into capital, which you can see is mainly solar PV. So this is, I guess, one of my babies. This is a project that we developed in Jamaica. And this is a typical example of financing. So I'm going to walk you through the typical financing structure that we use for this project, but also explain why it doesn't work for everything and why there are other innovative ways that we're trying to find to tackle how to finance renewable energy projects in our small markets. So this is a 51 megawatt peak project, 20-year PPA, good profitable utility, privately owned utility. Over 80% of JPS is owned by, 40% is Marubeni, 40% is East West Korea. So they have profitable EBITDA margins. And then we also, in terms of the financing, there was a lot of interest in financing this project. We raised $64 million. So again, nice chunky check, 16 million of which was equity, and 48 million coming in from multilateral banks, Proparco and FMO. We also were able to attract grant financing, right? Which, again, for really, really small projects, you may be able to get an umbrella financing, but it's very hard to attract this level of grant financing. So this project, I must say, really benefited a lot from scale. And it was commissioned in 2019. So the traditional project finance model. What is project finance? So if we had an audience here today without COVID, then I'd probably pose the question to the audience to see if anyone knew. But project finance typically they use something called non-recourse financing. So non-recourse financing means that the project on its own, with its cash flows, are able to sustain the debt and the equity, give the equity guys a return. So most of the renewable energy projects globally, large scale, are financed with this structure. And why does it work? It means that you're able to, you don't have to take out separate collateral. I mean, a lot of us from the Caribbean, when you go to a traditional bank, the first thing they ask for, a typical word is, well, I want collateral. I want a guarantee. And not just a guarantee, I may want a personal guarantee. This structure does not require that level of guarantee. This basically is just a quick overview of how we structured the financing for the Paradise Park project. So Ricam Nero was my company. NeoN is my strategic partner. So we basically had 100% of the equity. I syndicated a portion of my equity to a private equity fund out of Germany called MPC. I also was able to attract a local pension fund, which was great. Grace Kennedy, they put capital into the deal. And then USAID weren't really equity providers, but I added them here because they provided grant money, which facilitated the development of the project and is really critical because that's the early stage high-risk capital. And then you can see the bulk of the capital, even with all those names and logos on the top, the bulk of the capital came from debt. It came from multilateral financing, which kind of comes back to the first slide, show me the money, size matters, where is this money coming from? And it comes from traditional large multilateral institutions. So how do you manage to get this project to work? So when we're working with the multilateral institutions and more traditional equity financing, there's a whole series of due diligence blocks, right? The building blocks. I put legal in the biggest box. I hope Mr. Connolly will appreciate that, being a lawyer and also the minister. Legal tends to be the most expensive part of the entire transaction. Believe it or not, after spending several years developing the project, being in the bush, thinking that it's going to be more fascinating, it's a pile of paper. That large project that you see built in Jamaica, financial close, which is probably the most important day or milestone of the transaction, is basically the signing of tons and tons of paper. That's what sits behind these projects. So legal is a big building block. Technical, they do a lot of technical diligence, insurance, tax, model, ESG, environmental, all of these are elements that go towards underpinning the traditional project finance model. And if you don't have all of this, then you really would struggle to raise capital from the likes of a Proparco or an FMO. So I bring this back to small, because the whole topic is how innovative financing. So why does this matter when we look at small energy markets? Well, number one, all of this makes it very, very expensive, right, this traditional model. So due diligence and transaction costs, this is before we have even put a panel in the ground, basically before we've ordered anything. It was over $1 million just in diligence costs. And I look at the lawyers again because I kind of want to kill you. So we've spent all this work, we've taken all this risk, and you guys walk away with $1 million. I mean, that just seems really unfair to me. It's not just you, it's everybody. Everyone on that little building block. But the other thing, which is a challenge for small energy markets, is not only is it expensive, it takes a lot of time. So I was very optimistic by putting 6 to 12 months here. A number of other groups who've dealt with multilateral financing, and it's not even, I'm not going to blame the multilateral banks, even though some of them are slow, but I'm not going to blame them. It just takes a lot of time to do the work. So that is also really challenging when you may have a smaller installation that you want to put up now or in a month or in a quick period of time. The third element which makes this traditional model, I don't want to say fail, but I just want to say it's challenging for small energy markets, is information access, right? So there's a lot of traditional credit analysis that is done to be able to meet very stringent, what we classify as conditions precedents. So these are basically a list of hurdles that you need to jump before you can get to the finish line. And for a very small transaction, you may not have this information. 4, you perhaps can get to the point of 4 on the basis of number 1, but the scale economics are very, very challenging with this traditional model. And I put a number on it. I guess we could debate this number, but I think if your transaction, in terms of the loan, so it's not even a total project cost, if it's less than $20 million, this is exorbitantly expensive for this to work. So, but be as it may, let's just see. So what about the rest of the market? I'm still optimistic. They're not the only game in town. They're the biggest at the moment, but they're not the only game. So utility scale generation, yes, you could use that model, but if you're less than 20 megs, maybe we could stretch it down to 10. That model is just very, very expensive for you. Utility scale storage is an element. Again, super expensive, but these are other parts of the market which need financing. In addition to utility scale, the previous presenter, Mr. Gomez, mentioned DER, right, in his PP analysis, distributed energy resources. Now, Barbados has done very well by putting a lot of DER onto the market compared to some of the other countries in the Caribbean. Dominican Republic as well has done very, very well with DER. I was shocked to see they had over 100 megawatts of DER. That was perhaps like 2 years ago. So corporations, I would classify as distributed energy resources and residential. So these are all very, very small. A corporation, it would be exceptional for a corporation to have a $20 million deal, which can then attract DFI financing. So what we've done and this is with I'm only going to focus on this part. There are obviously many other parts. But what we try to do with Soleco, so Soleco is the second company I founded. The first company I founded focused mainly on utility scale. Soleco is trying to solve this issue around the innovative financing for smaller transactions. So what we've done is we've created a different approach to financing these types of deals. So what we do, we will finance. So let's say you're a large company, right? You want to put in solar. And this is more specific to the Jamaican market. But of course, depending on the regulatory framework, we could adjust the model. But so we will say, look, we will do the entire thing for you. We will finance it for you. We will cover the upfront costs, and you actually don't have to put any money in. And then you can lease the installation from us for your sole use over a period of time. Secondly, we're doing the development for you. So we do the design, we do the implementation. So we will basically pull together the entire transaction like your in-house developer. And these are the range of different types of solutions that we can provide, right? Ground-mounted, rooftop. We just added floating PV, which I'm super excited about. Carport energy storage. How does this relate back to financing? So I'm just going to play the video. Hopefully, the volume doesn't count out. So in terms of on the corporations, what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically view it as like a fractal theory. So in maps, they have this concept of fractals, where there are lots of small bits, but you can also bring it together and make it one larger bit. So how we're trying to tackle this with innovative financing is that we are basically going to do the financing at the higher level across all of the various companies and corporations that we work with to basically build these installations for them. So you can see they'll get to benefit from clean energy. We'll help them reduce their costs, and that's from day one without putting any money into the transaction because we're financing it. Happy to add energy storage. Actually kind of like that battery element. And then we also get to leverage a technical expertise that the companies themselves don't have to do again. So again, in terms of that point about scale, small energy market is an element of obviously the financing part, but there's also the capacity building part, which we try to bundle and do on a portfolio basis. So basically to deliver the solar asset for the clients. You can see a bit of footage from our Jamaican project there actually. And why is this important? It's important because we're therefore able to tackle one of those other markets besides the utility scale, which is what you're seeing here. All right, so finding scale. I'm going to bring up another cartoon. Sorry, I like the cartoons because I'm a very visual person and I find that it helps me remember things. Yes, that is Bill Gates. This is not intentionally an attack on Microsoft or Bill Gates. It's just a cartoon I found which was quite useful. So the gentleman, the Justice Department basically says to him, look, you're charged with 30 counts of antitrust violations and 1 count of kidnapping. And Bill Gates is like, kidnapping? And he's like, well, we're bundling the charges. So we're adding it all together. We're bundling it. So similarly, when we redo the transaction structure in terms of how to finance the smaller installations, we are bundling, but we're not adding the kidnapping charge. So this looks fairly similar to some extent to the one that I showed before, where we basically had the sponsors putting in equity, you had the multilateral financiers coming in, they're putting in the debt, but they're putting in the debt only into a single project. What we've done here is that we're bundling it. So we're basically, we'll create an asset co, or an asset company, which will basically have all of the various projects in it together, and we will handle the financing at that level. And then drip feed the financing into the smaller projects. The benefit of that are a couple of things, and it kind of addresses some of the issues that we had on the first slide. So number one, I wanted this to come to slowly reveal itself, but it came all at once. But anyway, so the first point is, again, on the cost element. So if you remember, for the traditional project financing model, we easily spent over $1 million US just on the lawyers, yes, and the other elements. And so in this case, we're able to then bundle that financing cost across a range of projects. So the $1 million is not sitting on a single project, it's actually going to be across the entire portfolio. The second benefit here with this structure is that the financing is already put in place. So what we've done is we've already put the credit facility in place, so we don't have to wait that 12 months to go through the process with the multilaterals because we've already done that, so it reduces implementation timing. The third element of this is we've also diversified the risk. So it allows us to get more favorable cost debt terms for the financing of these transactions, because now it's not just a single point credit risk, we're looking at across a range of projects. And then the last point, which I'll end on, is basically in terms of scale thresholds. So if you remember, I put kind of the estimate of roughly around 20 million. With this structure, or innovative, if you want to call it innovative financing, we're able to then meet those scale thresholds, which are required by types of like conventional debt, multilateral debt financing, but for smaller scale projects. But anyways, on that, I will end, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angela. And we're going to have an abridged panel session after this. But, you know, now we've heard from the economists, the parliamentarian, the regulatory person, and now the investor and developer. And I think right there, we have a pretty comprehensive snapshot of what it takes to get to the culmination of these projects. And right before the panel comes on, I'm going to ask another poll question. How would you rank the influence of the following for increasing renewable energy investments within the Caribbean? 1 being the highest, 2 being the lowest. Removal of subsidies on liquid fossil fuels, targeting the transport and power sectors. 2, the incentives, for example, customs duty removal, reduction to encourage electric vehicle ownership. 3, cost competitive net billing and or feed-in tariff schemes to encourage investments in distributed renewable energy and distributed storage. Regulations that promote IPPs, which generate energy from renewable sources. Renewable portfolio standards that mandate high shares of renewable energy in the power system. Remember, 1 is the highest and 2 is the lowest. And at this stage, I'd move straight into the panel discussion. And I want to remind the panel that we want to have that clear, hard recommendation at the end of your interventions and your discussions. Because what we want is those that are listening to come away with something that's a clear roadmap to where they should be, where they should be looking to be, and where they'll eventually end up if they stick the course. So without further ado, I'm going to move right into the panel. And because of timing, what I will ask each of the panel members to do, starting with Professor Winston Moore, who I believe is joining us again from the virtual world. And I'm going to ask him to come in and give his clear advice to anyone listening on how to marry policy, regulation, and investment in enabling the environment.
Thank you very much, Winston. I really enjoy saying that. One of the things that I would recommend is having a transparent and very clear directive from policymakers. So if you look around the world, and I'm going to use EV again as a really good illustration, and I'm going to provide a couple other illustrations a little bit later on. If you look at EV, many countries around the world have said after this particular date, we are only going to allow vehicles, electric vehicles, into the country, and what that has done, it signals to dealers, it signals to manufacturers that this country if you want to get into this country and you want to sell vehicles in this country, then you need to get on board the EV train if that is going to be successful. So I think number one is the regulators need to send a very clear and transparent signal to potential investors. Number two, we have to ensure that the system or the framework that we're putting in place to support whatever renewable energy technology or whatever green technology that we are putting in place is also very transparent, and it doesn't disadvantage particular players. One of the things that happens sometimes is that you might put a regulatory system in place, but it might benefit maybe foreign investors over local investors because maybe foreign investors have greater access to cheaper capital. You might also benefit the utility rather than the typical consumer. So you want to have a system that is transparent and fair, and that is also a second and really important part of the puzzle. And then thirdly, you have to look at the incentives that are already in place in the country. Sometimes we have tax incentives in a country in place from the 70s, the 60s, and we just leave them there because we're just accustomed to having these incentives in place. But if you look at them and you price them correctly, you can find that if you just remove those incentives, it can provide such a really great incentive for your renewable energy industry and your and green industries generally. And sorry for coming back to EVs all the time, but this is the one that I've been working on recently. When I did this survey in relation to EVs, most Barbadians are not very familiar in relation to electric vehicle technology. And when you actually give them that information and then ask, would you then purchase an electric vehicle? Most Barbadians then said yes, even without giving them an incentive. Because when you do the pricing as a consumer, you find that it's a lot cheaper to own an EV rather than to own a traditional fossil fuel vehicles. So it's providing more information, and it might also necessarily be to remove those traditional incentives that we have in place. So those are my three recommendations.
Thank you, Professor Moore. Angela, putting you on the spot now. What is the right mechanism to allow these projects, given the topic?
From a financing perspective, I would have to agree with the professor. I mean, number one is transparency and clear regulations. I mean, basically our project in Jamaica, there is no way we could have developed that had there not been a policy change and a step change. And so in Jamaica, what they did, they allowed independent developers to come into the market for the first time, which hadn't happened in renewables. They also had a very clear PPA structure, so they published an example of the PPA as to what it could look like. The regulator was involved to facilitate the discussions with the utility. I mean, Jamaica, we also have a monopoly utility, and I understand the sensitivity there in terms of the utility trying to maintain its traditional business model. But again, I think it needs, you need that regulatory power, as it were, to balance it, to maintain the profitability of the utility company, but also making sure that the interests of the customer, who at the end of the day is what we're here for, right? Is for the population of our countries, that they get a fair deal. So, I mean, it's perhaps a very simple answer, because number one is transparency and clarity, and also not changing, not U-turning. Because you do that, it sends the wrong signal. And lastly, I would leave with rule of contract, rule of law. If there's no rule of contract and honoring of contract, then from financiers, that petrifies us. We don't go to those markets, not if we have sense.
No, thank you, because we also know that investors will look at other projects if it takes too long to
Yes.
Come together. And for the regulator amongst us, Ernesto, what is the correct level of regulation, again, bearing in mind the topic? Ernesto, I think you're on mute.
Good. Sorry about that. Are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Good. I like this question. because this is a continuous problem that exists in Belize, and I am assuming it's typical. Your question, how to marry policy, regulation, and investment. Outside of the financing world and the ministerial world, we have a problem in that nothing goes well without a solid plan. And what we're finding out that it's not easy to marry the cabinet policy, the ministerial policy, the regulator, and the licensees. So as a result, we here as a regulator in Belize, we're seeing that we have to come up and help the making of the plan, and even the assisting government in suggesting, that they need to review policies or strengthen their policies so we can develop a strong plan. So this, from the regulator perspective, everything flows well if we have a solid plan, and a plan that is acceptable to the three different parties. Otherwise, the investor will take the advantage of not having a plan and proposing their plan upfront. And that will take a different course of action than the required one for the utility industry. Most of the times, for some reason, the plan is very much focused in generation, adding more solar, adding more other wind energy or anything like that. Everybody forgets about the grid and the network. There has to be resilience in the whole system in order to support that type of additional and different, especially intermittent type of energy. So the regulator is faced on the push from the investors of a project that is not out of a comprehensive plan that will look at the wellness of the entire system. So as far as we're concerned, the most important part here is an approved national plan that will take into elements all the moving parts of the system, especially resilience and security of power.
Thank you, Ernesto. As you're on in the virtual platform as well, how do people view the topic of subsidies, and when should you remove them and redistribute those proceeds?
Thank you for that question. There are not any responses just yet for that particular question.
Okay, so no one has come and asked that one. Okay, well, I will ask the Honorable Simmons one question, and then I will go back to each of the panelists and ask them to leave parting notes, again, for those energy ministers listening in virtual land, and not so much you, Honorable Minister, because from what we've heard today, I think you're well on the way and we've got it covered. But Honorable Simmons, how do governments deal with revenue loss versus the granting of incentives? How do you find that balance?
I think that we are in a very difficult position on that question. And I'll tell you why. It was probably around 2013 or so when the Inter-American Development Bank did a study looking at Barbados's circumstances, and would have indicated that they felt that we were, especially in the context of our tourism sector, granting way too many concessions, and that this should be clawed back. So it is a real issue. And developmentally, I think it confronts almost every small island developing state, all the small economies. We want to have the concessions out there. We want to have that kind of incentive platform, because that is what triggers or whets the appetite, if you will, for the investment. Question, therefore, is will people invest, irrespective of sector, if you don't have that? Let me answer that question by saying to you that I draw on my experience as tourism minister. I think that the point made about having a good plan is a very important point of departure. And there has to be a measure of confidence that the country has when you confront the international community on this question of investment and concessions. Every potential investor would like to come in and get as much as possible at the best possible deal. Question is, therefore, what do we as the policymaker, where do we draw the line? I think it comes with a lot of confidence on what the plan is, and that's certainly in the context of the tourism sector. You have to have a lot of confidence in what the country is offering as a product, how competitive the country is, what the demand is likely to be like, and how that demand can be sustained. Not fundamentally different set of considerations from the energy perspective. In my experience, it has been that if you have a good plan, the plan tends to speak for itself. If you have a good supporting infrastructure, for example, your regulatory environment is sound and can satisfy the critical eye of the potential investor, it makes your product potentially a lot more attractive. I think that a lot of the underpinning work that we had to do in terms of making sure that we have policy in place for batteries, making sure that we have a kind of airtight model PPA structure, those things are vitally important because it gives the potential investor that sense of security. And I believe that was the point that had previously been made in terms of making sure you have a good contractual framework. And then above and beyond all of that, like any other investment, people want to know that it is in a place where there is some broad stability, that there are all of the accompanying things that investors want to see in terms of order, structure, good governance generally, et cetera, absence of corruption, and so on. I think once you get all of those things in place, it gives you then the elbow room, where it is really just a question of political will, how far you wish to go down the line of granting more incentives and more concessions. But I say all of that to say that I genuinely believe that we have some control over the extent to which we go in order to attract investment. And there are a lot of things we can get right at home that make it very easy for the potential investor to say, I'm interested.
Thank you. And I think, forums like this also help because it brings everyone on the same stage and you can get the perspectives all at once, and I think that's important for those people listening in because, so often we act in silos and again, everyone wants the best deal for themselves, right? Yeah. We're human. And before I give everyone a chance to give a parting shot, I just want to reiterate again, in that parting shot, I want you to be clear and give a hard recommendation to finalize the session today because viewers are listening, they're watching. They have put some questions together, but I think we've covered them. So thank you for everyone in virtual land doing so. And I'd like to finish with Angela instead of going ladies first. Okay. And I will start with Ernesto. I will then move on to Professor Moore, then Honorable Simmons, and then Angela will finalize everything for us and take us away.
Well, thank you, Chair. First of all, it's a privilege to have been a part of this panel. I want to give my hard recommendation as the Chair asked for. It has happened to us, and I don't want it to happen to the Caribbean. You all need to make sure that when you're pricing new generation, you price the technology using available regional benchmarks. Do not try to price by displacement. And I know that in the Caribbean, friends from the Caribbean have mentioned to me that a developer would come and tell you that they want to put solar, and they would know that the Caribbean produces with diesel in the vicinity of 25 cents US a kilowatt hour, and they would propose solar to you at 10 cents US a kilowatt hour. When you look at the displacement rate, it looks fantastic, like if you're making a huge saving. But when you look at the benchmark, solar around the region is down between 6 and 5 cents US a kilowatt hour. So when you're adding new generation, price the technology using the available regional benchmark. Do not use displacement price, because 10 years from now, you will regret it. You will be locked up in a 25 or 30-year power purchase agreement with an overprice that you cannot change. So my big message is, price the technology, do not use displacement price. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Professor Moore?
I'm going to use the opportunity to speak about training. Now, the whole notion of greening the economy is so dynamic. And the great thing about greening the economy generates green jobs. Green jobs are usually higher paying. And if you lose your job after you've been working in a green industry, you're more likely to be re-employed a lot faster than other persons because you have the experience working in those industries. So it has really great characteristics, but there are two things that we need. We need to ensure that whatever training we provide, we do that training in conjunction with the private sector, because those are the persons doing the investment and those are the persons that know what type of training needs to be done. So that's number one. And then the second thing is that we need broad-based certification, because we need persons to be able to move from one industry to another industry. If we have persons that are locked into a particular industry because they only have certification, for example, for working in solar PV, and that certification can't move over to solar thermal, then you are actually, you're not taking into account of the fact that you have a dynamic economy. So we need broad-based certification as well. And I think the university, our secondary schools, our TVET institutions can really play a really great role in this part. But training is critical when you have a dynamic economy like associated with greening.
Thank you, Professor Moore. Honorable Simmons, your parting?
I would want to use the opportunity to speak to diversity. I think security of supply and certainty of supply is very critical. We are going into an area which is obviously feasible, but there's still some technological work that has to be done. And frankly speaking, from our experience in Barbados, we have, as I said, at one point, we've looked at wind. We obviously are looking at the solar PV, but we recognize that it would be unwise or imprudent to put all of the eggs into one basket. And so therefore, the wind is also onshore and offshore, fixed and floating foundations. Equally, ocean technology. We are quite frankly prepared to go as far as hydrogen. We are also looking at biogas, so that with a broad diversity, we create a number of areas where you have redundancy, if you will. And I think that certainty of supply gives again the opportunity for there to be confidence that this critical sector will not be dislocated on the basis of intermittent supply of energy.
Thank you, Honorable Simmons. And then to wrap us up.
The hardest one, after everyone has taken everything. So my leaving remarks to energy ministers, because I am private sector, you're right, and what do investors look for? They look for a return. If I were an energy minister, I would basically want a range of investors, but look for a long-term investor. Because at the end of the day, you're setting the rules of the game, right? So we are players, you are actually the game master. And if you set the rules in one direction, you will attract a certain type of capital. If you set it in another direction, you can attract a different type of capital. So picking up on the minister's point around diversification, there's diversification of technology, but I would also think about the diversification in terms of who do you want to invest in your country? You know, what kind of investor do you want to attract? And I would therefore set the rules of the game accordingly so that you can attract it and setting it with the accordance of a plan. Because yes, we can come to you and say, we'll give you a gigawatt of generation, but you might not need that. So set the rules of the game.
Yeah. No, and I think, you know, everyone has given some sound advice, and that's why we put them together on a stage. And I think that you've certainly got your 2 hours worth today from this illustrious group. And right before I extend my sincere appreciation to all of you, I'd like to just do the last poll question, which is, in what sustainable energy subsectors do CARICOM governments have the best opportunity to improve the use of policy and regulatory levers to attract more financing? Choose your top 3. Utility scale renewable energy, utility scale storage, grid modernization, smart grids, distributed renewable energy, distributed storage, electric vehicles, vehicle energy efficiency, building energy efficiency. Remember, choose your top 3. That only leaves me now to thank everyone listening in virtually, but most especially to thank the panel and the presenters today. I think we got what we asked for, and they delivered these very direct and strong arguments, noting the trifecta and the different motivations and positions of each of those parties. Again, on behalf of CARICOM, thank you very much for taking the time and giving us a bit of your knowledge. I'd just like to do one housekeeping bit. We have just over 45 minutes for the lunch break, and when you come back, you'll go into the next session. So thank you again on behalf of CARICOM, on behalf of the presenters and the panel, and we wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Session 1. Don't forget to join us later for Session 2.